I read the entire Holly Gibney series by Stephen King, so let's talk about all of them. Holly Gibney was first introduced in 2014 in Stephen King's Mr. Mercedes, and Stephen King has stated before that he absolutely loves Holly's character. Like, she's always kind of come back to him. She's like a supporting character in this trilogy as well as other books like If It Bleeds and The Outsider, and he loves her so much that he actually dedicated an entire book to her in 2023 called Holly. And what I think is really interesting about Holly as a character, and I'm sure Stephen King agrees as well, that she starts off as this like really quiet, mousy, mumbly, insecure, depressed woman who's being controlled pretty much by her mother and her uncle, like all this stuff. But underneath, she's like this super smart, like tech whiz, like she would be an incredible detective. And so throughout the entire books, like all these books that we're going to be going through, you watch Holly's growth all the way up to Holly, where she's like her confident, like butt-kicking, mystery-solving self. And so let's kind of talk about Mr. Mercedes to start off, because this is where she was introduced, and the overall essence of this book. Was it good? Was it not good? Characters introduced, the story, and then we'll continue from the rest of the Bill Hodgins series and then move over to like If It Bleeds, The Outsider, and end it off with Holly. So Mr. Mercedes is essentially kind of like a crime story. It doesn't have like that, what you would expect from Stephen King, the kind of like ghosty, demony, monstery, scary things. This one's more like a crime mystery, and that's actually what got me started into wanting to read this, because I don't do horror well at all. And so Mr. Mercedes follows retired detective Bill Hodgins, and basically before he retired, this man named Brady Hartsfield got into a Mercedes and he ran over a bunch of people, killing them, injuring them for life, all of the stuff, and he was never caught. And so Bill has always been like, oh, like he really wants to catch him, you know? And so he's retired now, and Bill is really depressed. And like, he's pretty much wasting his days just like watching really bad reality TV and playing with his dad's gun. So he's not having a good time. However, in a interesting turn of events, the Mercedes killer actually messages him and is basically like trying to convince him to take his life, because this man had convinced other people before to do it, and he had success in that. And so the person whose Mercedes he stole, he had convinced them that it was their fault that the Mercedes was like accessible, and so he was horrible, and he basically convinced her that it was her fault. And so he got a thrill out of that, and now he's basically tracking down other people, and he's like, what better person to track down than the detective? And so this book essentially follows Bill Hodgins and how he kind of gathers up these like unlikely friends throughout the way, like the guy who mows his lawn, a teenager named Jerome, even his little sister is involved to a degree, and also the introduction of Holly, who you don't actually meet until like way later in the book, but her introduction is really interesting because it's at a funeral, and like Holly's very, very quiet and really like insecure, and Bill kind of sees, like, without spoiling it, there's the person whose life Mr. Mercedes O'Brady had convinced to take is related to Holly in a way. And so he kind of recognizes a lot of the very similar signs in Holly, and so he kind of like reaches out to her, like tries to befriend her so she knows like she's not alone and like her life is worth it. And this immediately kind of like earns her trust, and she really likes Bill. And eventually they do actually become friends, and like really cool best friends. And so because of Bill reaching out to her, they end up kind of solving this case together. So it's like Holly and Jerome working with Bill, and they're trying to find where Brady is, because he's trying to do something big. Like he wants to go out with a bang. And he also has a bunch of like really messed up thoughts, especially about his mom and like Jerome's dog, and he's really racist too. So what I think is really interesting is like you really get into the mind of the bad guy in this book, and you really understand like how he's thinking and like what he's doing, and it's a really interesting contrast to like Bill's story and like how he perceives things and how he's trying to catch the guy. And so this one was a lot of fun, and it wasn't horror. Like it was not horror. I mean, Stephen King can write some really like gruesome scenes, but I wouldn't classify this as horror. I would classify this more as like crime, which I mean technically is like horror, but when I think horror, I think like supernatural. There was nothing supernatural in this one, and I think I would probably give this one like 4 stars. It was really engaging, and I really like the way that Stephen King writes these bad guys. Like, they're so twisted, and then you get the nice contrast of like the more normal, not twisted characters, and just following along with that. So yeah, Mr. Mercedes was really good, and just kind of like the start of Holly Gibney's journey. About a year later, in 2015, Stephen King released Finders Keepers, which is the second book in the Bill Hodgins trilogy. And this one essentially follows a man who's like a super fan of this writer, and he feels really betrayed by the writer because he feels like he was a sellout. And so him and like 2 of his accomplices go to this man's house, and they rob him and they kill him, and this man ends up taking all of these like notebooks and stuff where the author had put like unpublished stories, and he's like hopes that there's something in there that's kind of redeem his favorite author's favorite story and all of this, but he gets very spooked, and he ends up killing off his accomplices, and he ends up getting arrested for something completely unrelated to that and unrelated to the crime he committed, and he's put away in prison. But before he was put away in prison, he did bury all of these books in this like sturdy little like box then, and he put it underneath like near this kind of like lake and under a tree and stuff, and then he goes off to prison. And so 35 years later, a young teenage boy named Pete actually finds the like buried treasure, and inside of it is like a bunch of short stories and poems and the continuation of the Jimmy Gold series, which is the one that Morris, the man who's currently in prison and killed his favorite author, who is the author of the Jimmy Gold series, said he's a sellout, and he didn't like the way the last book ended. However, that wasn't actually how the books ended, because there were a bunch of unpublished ones that just never ended up going into the stores and whatnot. So this young boy now is like able to read all of these stories that nobody else has ever read, and he could make a lot of money off this. And his family, coincidentally, his dad is actually a victim of the Mr. Mercedes attack, and so he can't walk properly, and he's been at home for a long time, he can't find a job, like all of this, and so they're really poor, and Pete's mom and dad are pretty much on the verge of divorce because of all these like things happening. But inside of this like treasure chest, not only is it like the notebooks, it's also a bunch of money. Like I think it was like $40,000 of money. And so Pete knows that if he gives it to his parents are probably gonna not accept the money or give it to the police or something, but he really wants to help them. So what he does is he essentially mails them money repeatedly, like throughout the months, just to kind of like help them without ever saying that it was him. And so the way that Bill Hodgins and Holly Gibney's story kind of like collides here is that Morris is released from prison, and when he goes to find his treasure that he's been waiting 35 years to finally read and look at, it's all gone. And so he tracks down this teenage boy, Pete, and like a bunch of like stuff happens, and Holly and Jerome and Bill, they get involved with this and they work together. And I think that this was another really great just like step in Holly's confidence as a character, and how she's getting better when it comes to like interacting with people, or kind of like taking another leap towards solving a case and really just like kind of handling it when she needs to. And so it's really great growth with Holly's character, as well as just like the continuation of the friendship of Bill and Jerome and Holly, and they're just like such a great trio. Out of the entire Bill Hodgins trilogy, this was my absolute favorite one. Like I read it probably in like 2 days, maybe less. It was so good. I don't know if it was because it was like about a writer, and anything that's like about writers or whatever, I'm always like, oh, I'm obsessed with this. But I just thought that like the pacing was so good, the story was so good, everything about it. Like this is a 5-star read for sure. It was so good. I loved this one. 1 year later, in 2016, the final book in the Bill Hodgins trilogy came out, and that is Stephen King's End of Watch. I personally don't think that this one was very good. And I think if it was a different part of a different story, it would have been better. But the supernatural aspects of this one, I felt just didn't align with the rest of the Bill Hodgins trilogy. And I'm gonna kind of explain why. So this one follows Brady and how he's pretty much like a vegetable in the hospital. And there are all these interesting like murders that are coming around with people who have some relation to the Mercedes killer. And there's also this fish game. And that sounds really weird. I don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it, but the fish game essentially puts people in a state of hypnosis, and that allows the supernatural aspect of this book to go into these people's brains and essentially convince them to take their lives or even take the lives of their loved ones and then themselves. And so this one's really dark, to be honest. This one also broke my heart. This book, I'm not gonna say, again, I'm not gonna spoil it on you, but this one was really sad in like a multitude of different ways. But it was really great, again, to watch Holly and Bill and Jerome and even Barbara to an extent, again, in this one where like Finders Keepers, funny, right? Because that's the name of the last book, is like kind of the agency that they have, and they don't focus on like murders. They're more about like tracking down like people who are on bail, people who owe people money, like that kind of thing. And so Bill and Holly just like, they work together now. And I just think that it's really great. It's such a great step because Holly had so like a lot of difficulty her entire life, just like in general, like she never had a job or really anything like that. Like she didn't believe that she was good enough, and her mom thought that like Holly had to be locked away pretty much at all times. And so now Holly's just like, she's free, like she's doing what she loves and what she's good at, and she has friends and everything. So like this is a really great step for her because like she has a lot of independence now, and you really see that growth with her. However, as I mentioned, because of like the disconnect that I felt with this book versus the other two in the trilogy, I would probably only give it 2 stars, to be honest. Like I really struggled getting through this one, and I don't think it was like bad. I just don't think that it really matched with like what was happening in like this trilogy. So those are my thoughts on the trilogy. In 2018, so 2 years after the Bill Hodgson trilogy ended, came The Outsider. I loved The Outsider. The Outsider, honestly, you don't even see Holly for a really long time. Like I think it was like the middle of the book when you actually see her. But that's okay because the build-up and the storytelling of The Outsider was so good. It takes place in an Oklahoma city, and 11-year-old boy is murdered in a really brutal way, like disgusting. And so the detective on the case, Ralph Anderson, is basically looking into it, and it seems like all the evidence is saying and eyewitnesses are saying that it's the really popular, well-loved, like sports coach man named Terry Maitland. Terry says that he's completely innocent, as people do, but there's so much evidence about it that it's like, there's no way, right? But this is where it gets interesting because there's information, like there's definitely proof of him being there, but there's also proof of Terry being in a completely other place at the completely same time. And so Ralph is trying to figure out like what's going on because he does this like super public arrest of Terry right at a baseball game. And due to the nature of the way that the 11-year-old boy was killed, people do not want somebody like that near their children at all. And so The Outsider, once all of this great information and like the setup starts, Holly Gibney is kind of weaved into the case because Ralph Anderson is trying to call Bill Hodgins, but it's actually Holly who's there. And so Holly comes on over and she starts to kind of do her own investigating. This is the first time she's really done something like really solo, which I think is fantastic for Holly's character because usually it's like she's working with Jerome, or she's with Barbara, or she's with Bill, or she's with Bill and Jerome, but this time like completely independent. I mean, technically like Bill Anderson is there, but during the first part of the investigation, he's not really there. So it's just like Holly doing what Holly does best, and that's solving mysteries. And I think it was really cool as well because like Holly's like, guys, like it's a supernatural thing going on here, and they're like, we don't believe you, lady. And she's like, well, it's what it is. So I think that this one was good. Like the supernatural aspect of this one was perfect. Whereas I felt like End of Watch, I don't know, I feel the disconnect with that one. But with this one, I feel like it was just done in such a good and tasteful way. And as well, like watching Holly befriend new characters, now that she's really like matured, she's become more confident, she really knows what she's doing. And like even though she's scared, and there are definitely times where she's like terrified, even like fighting against people or kind of explaining like what she thinks, but she still does it. And that's a major sign of growth in Holly's character, so much more from like when she was first introduced, and like she would mumble and she could barely even order anything for herself. And now here she is like standing in front of these like detectives, and she's like, guys, it is a supernatural thing, like this is what it is, and this is all the evidence and all the proof that I have for that. And it's like, yes, Holly, you go. So Stephen King's The Outsider, definitely a 5-star book in my opinion. This, like the entire, like all of the books that Holly Gibney was in, this one is my all-time favorite. I don't reread books, but this is one that I probably would just because it was so good. And apparently there's an HBO series about it according to the little advertisement on this book. So I don't know if it's any good. If you've seen it, let me know if it's worth it, because I love this book. In 2020, Stephen King released 4 novellas in this one book called If It Bleeds. And within this, the 4 novellas, their first one is Mr. Harrington's Phone, which I really, really liked. The second one was The Life of Chuck, which really confused me. And then when I thought about it later, I was like, you know what, that's actually really cool. The third one is If It Bleeds, which features Holly Gibney, like her whole like solo, no like people helping kind of story. And then the fourth one was The Rat, which that one really confused me as well. And I had to go on Reddit afterwards to like figure out what I just read. So If It Bleeds, that's the one we're gonna focus on like for the novellas, because we're talking about Holly here. This one is interesting as well because we saw in The Outsider how she started to take on a bit of like that solo aspect, and then later on like she met with Ralph Anderson and like they kind of worked together for the rest of the case. But this one, it's completely solo Holly. Holly ends up seeing very like similar signs that somebody may be another outsider, which is kind of like the term that she dubbed like the creature from the previous book. And she's like, okay, yeah, like I need to do something about this. Like she can't stop thinking about it and like the nuances, because she gives a very, very good attention to detail. And that's how she kind of noticed like something's weird about this newscast, because this school, like this children's elementary school, if I recall correctly, a bomb was there and like it blew up and it was like horrible. Like all these poor innocent children died. And there's this guy in the news and his name is Chet, and he's instantly reporting about it. And Holly notices like his mole, he has a mole, but then the next time she sees him in a different clip, his mole is gone. And she's like, that's super weird. And like, it really, really, really bugs her to the point that's the only thing she can think about and focus on. And so she starts to suspect that this Chet guy is involved and there's an outsider-ish kind of thing going on. And so she does this complete solo investigation. And it was really great because, again, like I said, like The Outsider really set it up for, you get a bit of her solo and then she gets a bit of support from other characters. But this one, it was like Holly to the max. There was, of course, like support towards like the final kind of like pages, but other than that, like the whole investigation was like Holly, Holly, Holly. And I thought it was really impressive. And I'm like, I'm so proud of Holly. So this one was interesting. It wasn't as good as The Outsider, but it wasn't like end of watch. This one I would probably say is about a 3.5 or a 4 for If It Bleeds. I thought it was entertaining and fun, fast paced for the most part. I do remember there were some parts though that I found were like a little bit slow, or like I was a little bit bored. So 3.5 or 4, but it's still great just to watch Holly kind of evolve as a character. And finally, in 2023, Stephen King released Holly. So I think one of the reasons that I liked this one so much is, again, it didn't have as much of the supernatural aspect. Like this one didn't have any of the supernatural aspect. It was just really, really disturbing people doing disturbing things, which I think is great. Not like in real life, but it's like a story. So this book starts off exactly telling you like who the bad guys are, what they do, and kind of like why they think a certain way. And I think that's something that I really like about Stephen King's writing, that you get to really get into the minds of the bad guy. It's like that show Criminal Minds. I love that show when I was a teenager, and it focused on like the bad guys and then also like the people trying to solve it. And so I think that Stephen King is like very similar in that manner. I mean, he's like the OG. And so like I really like that you really understand the bad guys and stuff. And so this one, the prologue just starts off with like the bad guys, and it's actually like these 2 elderly people, Rodney and Emily Harris. And they're both really, really well-known like professors in the area. And Rodney, the husband, has always been really into like natural wellness, essentially, to like try and help your body. And so I don't know, honestly, like how he convinces his wife, maybe because there's a few screw loose, I don't know. But basically what they do is they find really healthy individuals, they kill them, and they eat different parts of their body because they believe that it's gonna keep them healthy and young and strong. So pretty disturbing. So it kind of starts off, you know, just like kind of giving that, like what the people that there's kind of kidnapping, and because they're like old people, right? Nobody suspects them. They think that they're just helping some nice old people, and then they wake up and they're in this really messed up box, kind of like Joe from You has. And so what happens is it skips over to present day because these old people have been doing this for a very long time and they haven't got caught. And so what happens in present day is there's a woman named Penny Doll, and her daughter Bonnie has been missing. And so she ends up calling Finders Keepers where Holly is. And Holly kind of gets roped into the case in this way. And she thinks it's just like a runaway or like a disappearance. And so Holly starts to investigate. This is when she starts to realize like there is something disturbing happening to people. And while Holly is kind of like investigating these old people cannibals, we actually get a lot of development between like Jerome and his sister Barbara, because in the Bill Hodgins series, like Jerome starts off as a teenager and Barbara's like 8 years old or something. So now Barbara's like 18 or 19 and she loves poetry, and so she is essentially like trying to get her, like she's working with a really famous poet who actually coincidentally lives right next door to the cannibal couple, and that stresses me out so much. And so she's basically doing the poems and she's getting a bit of like instruction, and she's trying to like win this poetry contest. And then on the flip side, her brother Jerome, his book that he's been working on and the other books that he kind of like mentions this, is published, and he's pretty much living the dream. So again, it's like a solo Holly adventure. You do of course get some nice interaction with Ralph Anderson and characters that we saw before, and so that's always nice. But I really just love watching like Holly again go from that like shy, mumbling, insecure girl to this like, to be honest, like pretty cool like detective. And sometimes she's harsh when she needs to be, and like you really see her come out of her shell. And it's also during COVID, which I thought was a really interesting kind of like take on a story, because I have never read a story that has COVID in it at all. And I thought that was really neat, because like the books prior were written before COVID, and so when they take place in 2020, not entirely accurate to the time period, but I mean nobody could have predicted that. So it is really interesting to see, like, just read a story where like COVID is kind of part of it, like that's part of the life that we all lived. And I thought it was really cool like how Stephen King kind of like incorporated it in. I really enjoyed this one. This one I think as well is a 5-star read for me, and it was because of just like how entertaining it was, and like the whole concept of like old people and that they're eating people, and like the placebo effect, and like all of this, and just like Holly being super cool and all of that. Like I just thought it was really great and really well done. Now, I certainly don't believe Holly's story is done. No way, especially with the ending of Holly. And so these are all the books that currently exist in the Holly Gibney series. So as of recording this, I've read all of them. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell notification. That way you get notified anytime a new video comes out. As you can tell, I love to read books. I love to talk about books. I read a variety of books. If you like books and you like hearing somebody talk about books, or you're looking for books that maybe you're interested in reading, or you want people's thoughts on books, don't forget to hit subscribe. And if you enjoyed this video, and if you enjoyed any of the Holly Gibney books at all, don't forget to hit the like button, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!